Every year, my brother and I take a late-night drive. On Christmas Eve, it started as a dumb tradition back in high school. When we first got our licenses, just cruising around our small town, listening to music, talking about life, it felt like we were the only people in the world during those quiet winter nights. Even as we got older, moved to different cities, we still made time for it. We'd meet at my parents' house, exchange gifts, then head out onto the empty roads. It was peaceful, familiar, but this year something was different. This year we weren't alone. It started normal enough. We left around midnight. The snow had stopped falling, but the roads were still slick with ice. We took the usual route, winding through the back roads past the farms and old abandoned houses. The stars were out. Everything felt quiet. Too quiet. My brother Matt noticed it first. "We haven't seen a single car," he said. I shrugged, figured people were just home with their families. But the more I thought about it, the more it nagged at me. Usually we'd see at least 1 or 2 cars, even this late. But the road was completely empty. No headlights in the distance, no taillights ahead. Just us and the dark. About 30 minutes in, we passed a house that made me do a double take. It was an old Victorian-style home, the kind you'd expect to see in a ghost story. Every year we passed it, it was always abandoned, but tonight the windows were glowing with warm yellow light. I pointed it out to Matt, but before he could respond, something moved in the upstairs window. A figure, a woman, standing perfectly still, staring down at us. She didn't wave, didn't move, just stood there like a mannequin. I felt my stomach twist, and suddenly the warmth of the car wasn't enough to keep the chill off. We kept driving. I tried to shake the feeling of those eyes on us, but it stuck like a bad dream. A few minutes later, Matt reached over and turned the music down. "Do you hear that?" he asked. At first I didn't, then I did. A faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the back of the car. We both turned around, nothing there. But as soon as we faced forward, something darted across the road ahead of us. I slammed on the brakes. The car skidded, sliding sideways before coming to a stop in the middle of the road. Our headlights cut through the trees, but there was nothing there. "What the hell was that?" Matt whispered. I didn't answer. My heart was hammering too fast. I slowly pressed on the gas, moving forward. Carefully, we drove in silence for a while, listening to the soft hum of the tires against the icy pavement. Then my phone rang, an unknown number. The second I saw it, my stomach dropped. Something about it felt wrong. I ignored it. But almost immediately, Matt's phone rang. Same number. He didn't answer either, but now the air inside the car felt heavy, suffocating, like we were being watched. Another 5 minutes passed, and then the phone rang again. But this time, it wasn't mine or Matt's. It was coming from the back seat. A soft, muffled ring, like it was buried under something. We froze. Neither of us moved, neither of us turned around. I could feel my pulse in my throat. I reached for the rearview mirror, angling it slightly, trying to see the back seat. But it was too dark. All I could make out was a shape slumped low behind my seat. Matt slowly reached out and flipped on the interior light. Nothing there. The back seat was empty. My breath came out in shaky gasps. Matt's face was pale, his hand still hovering near the light switch. We didn't speak. We just kept driving faster than before. I just wanted to get back to town, to see other cars, to hear people, to feel normal again. But then the headlights started flickering once, twice. Then total darkness. We were plunged into pitch black. The engine was still running, but the headlights were completely dead. I hit the switch over and over. Nothing. We couldn't see the road. We couldn't see anything. Matt grabbed his phone, turned on the flashlight. He pointed it out the windshield, and that's when we saw it. Figures standing in the road. Not one, not 2 dozens, all standing shoulder to shoulder, blocking the way back to town. Their faces were obscured by the dark, but their bodies were rigid, completely still, like statues. My hands clenched the wheel. I didn't know what to do. Matt whispered Jason, back up, back up. But when I looked in the mirror, there were figures behind us too. A wall of them, stretching into the night. My hands were shaking. I pressed down on the horn. It blared through the night. But the figures didn't move. They just stood there, motionless, silent, waiting. My mind was racing. This had to be a prank, a nightmare, something. But then I saw it, a face illuminated by the dim glow of Matt's phone light, the same woman from the house, the one who had been staring at us from the window, only now she was closer, right in the middle of the road. Her mouth was moving, but no sound was coming out. Just silent words forming over and over. Matt was gripping my arm, his nails digging into my skin. Jason, go. Now his voice was shaking. I threw the car into reverse tires, screeching against the icy road. The figures didn't chase us, they didn't move, they just watched as we peeled backwards, taking random turns, anything to get away. The headlights flickered back to life. Just as we hit a familiar street, the first street light we saw felt like a gift from God. We didn't stop driving until we reached the town center, finally surrounded by normal people, normal lights, normal life. We parked in front of a gas station, both of us breathing heavily. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Eventually Matt pulled out his phone, checked the time, but something was wrong. It was 4:17 a.m., but that didn't make sense. We left my parents' house at midnight. The drive should have taken an hour at most. Where had the last 3 hours gone? I checked my own phone, same time, same missing hours. A thick silence settled between us. Neither of us wanted to ask the question, what happened out there? I told myself, maybe we just got lost. Maybe the fear made it feel longer, but deep down, I knew better. Something wasn't right. We drove home in silence, parked the car in my parents' driveway, and went inside. We didn't tell them what happened, didn't talk about the missing time. But I saw the way Matt looked at me, like he knew. We couldn't just forget. The next morning, I went out to the car, planning to leave early. But when I opened the door, my heart nearly stopped. Sitting there in the middle of the back seat was a phone, an old flip phone covered in dirt. It wasn't mine, it wasn't Matt's. I picked it up, hesitated, then flipped it open. One missed call from an unknown number. My stomach lurched. I pressed the call history. But before I could do anything else, the screen went black. The battery completely dead. I dropped it like it burned me, slammed the car door, and went back inside. I didn't tell Matt about the phone, didn't tell anyone, but I knew deep down we had brought something back with us, and I was terrified that one day it would call again. When I moved into that cabin deep in the woods, I thought I had finally found peace. I had been living in the city my whole life, and after years of stress, noise, and the feeling of being watched by strangers, every day I just wanted to be alone. The cabin was cheap, almost suspiciously cheap. But I didn't care. It was sturdy, isolated, surrounded by miles of thick forest, with only one other house anywhere nearby, an old place barely visible through the trees. It belonged to a man named Walter. He introduced himself the day I moved in, walked right up to my porch. Before I had even finished unpacking, Walter was an older guy, maybe in his late 60s, tall and wiry, with grey stubble and deep-set eyes that never quite met mine. He had this way of speaking, slow, deliberate, like every word was measured. He told me he'd lived in the area his whole life, said people used to live all over these woods, but they moved away one by one. He was the last one left. Besides me, he handed me a jar of something dark and thick, homemade preserves. He said, "Welcome to the woods, hope you like your privacy." I thanked him, but something about his presence unsettled me. I couldn't put my finger on it. Over the next few weeks, I settled into a routine, worked from home, took long walks, chopped firewood. It was exactly the quiet life I had been hoping for. But then weird things started happening. It began small. My back door was unlocked one morning, even though I was sure I had locked it at night. The next day, I noticed footprints in the dirt outside my bedroom window. I tried to brush it off, maybe. I had forgotten to lock the door, maybe the footprints were old. But it kept getting worse. One night, I woke up to a tapping sound at my window. It was slow, rhythmic, like someone was deliberately trying to get my attention. I stayed completely still, staring at the window. The tapping continued for almost a minute, then silence. I forced myself to get up, peeked through the blinds. Nothing but trees. I barely slept after that. The next morning, I found something on my porch, a pile of small bones cleaned and stripped, stacked neatly like some kind of offering. I felt sick. Walter came by later that day. I told him about the bones. He looked at me for a long time, then just said, "Weird things happen in these woods. Best not to think too hard about them." His words stuck with me, but I wasn't about to just ignore it. I started locking my doors, double-checking my windows, keeping a knife under my pillow. But the feeling of being watched never went away. One night, I heard something outside. Not tapping this time, but shuffling footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. I turned off the lights, moved quietly to the window, trying to see, but whoever it was stayed just out of sight. Eventually the sound stopped, but I didn't sleep at all. The next day, I found deep scratches on my front door, long, jagged marks, like something had been trying to get in. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I decided to install cameras, ordered them online, had them delivered to the nearest town, drove an hour to pick them up, spent the whole day setting them up. I felt safer that night, knowing I would finally catch whoever was messing with me. But when I checked the footage the next morning, my stomach turned to ice. The cameras caught movement around 3 a.m. A figure, just barely visible, standing at the edge of the tree line. Not moving, just standing there, staring at my cabin. But that wasn't the worst part. Sometime around 4 a.m., the figure got closer, but the footage glitched out completely, like something had interfered with the signal. When it came back, the figure was gone, and the scratches on my door were fresh. I felt trapped, nowhere to go, no neighbors to help. Except Walter, and I didn't trust him. I decided to visit him anyway. See if he had seen anything. I knocked on his door. He answered after a long pause, looked at me with that same unreadable expression. I told him about the cameras, the figure in the woods, the scratches on my door. He listened, nodded, then said, "I told you best not to think too hard about these woods." I had enough, I told him. I was thinking about leaving, that something was wrong here. His expression darkened. For the first time, he actually looked angry. He stepped forward, lowered his voice. "You should stay. Leaving won't change anything." I left without another word. I didn't want to be near him anymore that night. I barely slept, kept my knife close. The next morning, I made my decision. I was going to pack up, leave the place behind. I didn't care about the money, I just wanted out. I started throwing my things into bags, moving fast, trying not to think about Walter or the thing in the woods. But then I found something that made me stop cold. Underneath my bed, a small wooden figure carved from some dark, twisted piece of wood. It was shaped like a man, but its face was wrong, stretched, grinning, its arms too long, its hands curled into claws. I had never seen it before, had no idea how it got there. I picked it up, felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like something was watching me. I threw it into the fireplace, watched it burn. That night was the worst of all. I didn't even try to sleep. I sat in the living room, knife in hand, every light on, watching the windows. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside, slow, heavy. They stopped at my door, then the knob turned. Once, twice, I held my breath, then silence. I checked the cameras. The next morning, the footage was worse than before. The figure was back, but this time it was closer. I could make out details. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, its limbs too long, too thin, and then it moved. Its face came into view, and my blood went cold. It was Walter. But it wasn't. It was him, and it wasn't. His mouth was stretched in two. That same unnatural grin as the wooden figure. His eyes were black hollow voids. He stood at my door for hours, not moving, just grinning at the camera. The footage cut out just before sunrise. When it came back, he was gone. I didn't pack. I didn't think. I just grabbed my keys, got in my car, and drove. I left everything behind, never went back, never looked back. I don't know what Walter was, or what lived in those woods. But I know one thing for sure, I wasn't supposed to leave, and I think whatever it was still knows where I am. I have been driving for Lyft for nearly 5 years, mostly during the late night shifts, when the city is quieter and the tips are better. I have picked up my fair share of strange people. But this one still makes my skin crawl to this day. I almost quit driving altogether after this night, but something about the randomness of it all scared me. Even more, because it could happen again at any time, anywhere. It was a little after 3 a.m., and I was about to call it a night when a request popped up not too far from my usual drop-off spots. The pickup location was a gas station on the outskirts of the city, a place that was barely lit and surrounded by empty lots and abandoned buildings. At that hour, the streets were nearly deserted, except for a few trucks parked in the distance, the kind of place where anything could happen and no one would ever know. I hesitated for a second, but then accepted the ride, thinking it was just some late-night worker or a drunk trying to get home. I should have trusted my gut as I pulled into the lot. I didn't see anyone at first, just a single flickering light near the front entrance. Then from behind the side of the building, someone emerged. A tall, thin man wearing an oversized jacket with the hood pulled up. His hands were buried deep in his pockets, and his head was tilted slightly downward. As he walked toward my car, something about the way he moved was unnatural, like he was being controlled by invisible strings, jerky and uncoordinated. I unlocked the door and watched as he slid into the back seat. Without saying a word, normally passengers at least mumble some kind of greeting, but not this guy. He just shut the door slowly and sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead. I glanced at the rearview mirror and felt my stomach drop. He wasn't looking at his phone or out the window. He was staring at the back of my head, his eyes wide and unblinking. The ride request showed the destination was about 15 minutes away, deep into a quiet suburban neighborhood. I swallowed hard and forced myself to speak. "Trying to keep the mood light, rough night, man?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. No response. He just kept staring. I turned my attention back to the road, but I could feel his gaze drilling into my skull. The silence stretched on, and I could hear my own breathing filling the car. My fingers gripped the wheel tighter. I checked the mirror again, and for a split second I thought I saw his lips move, like he was whispering to himself. But no sound came out. I turned up the radio, slightly trying to break the unbearable tension. The moment the music filled the car, he spoke. "Turn it off." His voice was low and strained, like he hadn't spoken in a long time. I reached down and shut the radio off immediately. I didn't say anything else, just focused on driving. My heart was beating a little faster now. Something was definitely off about this guy. Maybe he was high, maybe he was just some creep. But either way, I wanted the ride to be over as soon as possible. We drove in silence for a few more minutes, and then he leaned forward slightly. I could see his reflection more clearly now, and my breath hitched. He was smiling, not a normal smile, though his lips were stretched too wide, his teeth slightly yellowed and uneven. His eyes still locked onto me. "Ever wonder what it would be like to disappear?" he asked. My mouth went dry. I forced a small, nervous laugh, hoping it was just some weird joke. "Nah, man, I try not to think about stuff like that," I said, trying to sound casual. He didn't laugh back. Instead, he tilted his head slightly and said, "I think about it all the time." My hands clenched the wheel, my knuckles turning white. We were only about 5 minutes away now. I just had to keep calm and get him to his destination. He sat back again, but I could see him shifting, slightly out of the corner of my eye, like he was adjusting something. Then I heard a soft rustling sound, the kind of sound fabric makes when someone moves quickly. I glanced at the mirror again, and my stomach dropped. He was holding something in his hands. It was dark and shiny. At first, I thought it was a phone. But as my eyes focused, I realized it was something else, something much worse. A straight razor, old and rusted, the kind barbers used to use. He was running, his thumb along the blade, absent-mindedly staring at it, like it was the most fascinating thing in the world. I felt my pulse in my throat. My foot hovered over the gas pedal, ready to speed the hell out of there. But we were in a residential area, now quiet and empty. The last thing I wanted was to get into an accident with this guy in my back seat. I had to play it cool, had to get him out of my car without setting him off. "Hey man, you almost home?" I said, forcing a casual tone. He didn't answer. He just kept staring at the blade. Then, without warning, he dragged it slowly across his palm, slicing his skin open, a deep red line forming. Immediately, I gasped involuntarily, and he finally looked up at me, his grin wider than ever. "Pain is just a trick of the brain," he whispered. My hands were shaking now. I kept my eyes on the road, but my mind was screaming at me to do something, anything. We were only a couple blocks away. I could make it. I just had to stay calm. I reached for my phone on the dashboard, pretending to adjust my GPS. But really, I was trying to text someone. Anyone before I could type a single word. He lunged forward so fast I barely had time to react. His breath was hot against my neck. His hand grabbed my shoulder, squeezing hard, enough to make me wince. "Don't try anything stupid," he hissed. His other hand, still holding the razor, hovered dangerously close to my throat. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I forced myself to nod, keeping my hands firmly on the wheel. I could feel his fingers twitching, his grip tightening and loosening, like he was debating something. We were seconds from his stop. I saw the house coming up on the GPS, a dark, unlit home with no cars in the driveway. I started to slow down, but before I could reach the curb, he did something that made my blood run cold. He leaned in, even closer, his mouth inches from my ear, and whispered, "Take me somewhere else." I swallowed hard. Where he didn't answer, just pressed the blade a little closer. I had no choice. I kept driving further into the neighborhood, away from any main roads. He hummed softly to himself as I turned down a dark street lined with trees. I didn't know where to go, what to do. My mind was racing. And then, suddenly flashing red and blue lights in the distance, my heart leaped. A police car was parked at the intersection up ahead. I did the only thing I could think of. I slammed on the brakes, sending him flying forward just enough for me to throw open my door and bolt out of the car. I ran straight toward the cop, waving my arms, yelling for help behind me. I heard the car door open and slam shut, heavy footsteps pounding against the pavement. But then silence. I turned back, expecting to see him charging after me. But he was gone, just gone, like he had vanished into thin air. The officer questioned me, checked my car, but there was no sign of him. No blood, no razor, nothing. I showed the officer the right details, but the account had been deleted. The address I had driven to was abandoned, the house empty and falling apart. They searched the area but found nothing in the end. All they could do was take my statement and advise me to be careful. After that night, I installed a dash cam, never drove that late again, and never accepted another ride from a gas station. Something tells me if I had taken him wherever he wanted to go, I would have never come back.